Glasgow COP26 done, and another victory to us. For decades, we've manipulated governments, monopolised markets, and forged agreements that keep us going, make us richer and you poorer. But how do we get here? What really happened at COP26, and how we'll really meet and beat these guys at this climate emergency? This video is a companion piece to Australia's pathetic COP26 targets and explores Morrison's plan, the tech that will supposedly save us all, and how fossil fuel companies are the puppet masters pulling the strings in dictating climate policy the world over. At the end of this video, it will jump straight over to the body of that video essay, so I hope you enjoyed them both. To truly understand why Australia went to COP26 with a weak emissions target, it's best to take a look at our history of climate politics. I posted that in a separate video, link is up here and also down in the description. However, in this video, I'm going to conveniently divide it into several different chapters, so feel free to use them to jump to the section that you want to explore. We'll dive into some tricks that some use to pollute more than ever and claim that they're actually carbon neutral. We'll take a look at the tech being promoted as getting us all out of this mess, and then we'll conclude by unpacking why this government's piss-weak plan is going to be using your taxes to prop up fossil fuel companies who are not interested in global warming, the climate emergency, or your wallet. We are just 29 years away from 2050. Australia has been doing its bare minimum around climate action for over 30 years, so think of this as a wake-up call. In the early 1990s, Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke announced that Australia would cut its greenhouse emissions by 20%, using 1988 as its basis and a target date of 2005. This was on the background of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was held a few years before it. But in Australia, we changed our leaders quicker than our undies, and so Bob was replaced by Paul Keating in late 1991, and in the middle of a recession, momentum stalled and Keating was defeated at the 1996 election by John Howard. Under Howard's rule, he focused on the potential economic impact of climate action over inaction. These two were perhaps the turning point of climate lethargy in Australia and what some would call the climate wars. That is, one favouring the do nothing, she'll be right mate, as the cost is too great, and the other is about doing something, albeit too slowly, and all of them being dictated behind the scenes by these guys. This is a theme you'll hear repeated many times in this special. In a decade of climate change becoming a mainstream thing, the Howard government did something that seems completely crazy to us now. They successfully negotiated at the 1997 Kyoto Climate Change Conference, also known as COP number 3, that they would set to increase Australia's emissions by 8% above 1990 levels. Increase. The rest of the world actually cut theirs. At Kyoto, the Australian delegation, which was stacked by the way, with representatives from the fossil fuel industry, they demanded Australia be given a special clause to allow the inclusion of carbon emissions from land clearing. Known as the Australian Clause, it gave us an artificial head start on emission reductions. How? Because land clearing in Australia had declined sharply between 1990 and 1997 following a spike in 1990. Why? Because, well, states thought, you know what, our soils are getting pretty bad and water is not very good either. Soil erosion is a bad thing. So they actually cut a lot of the land clearing that had occurred. So states doing something, federal doing nothing, and benefiting from it immensely. This 8% win, or artificial starting point, was used by the government up until recently. And so, with this Australia clause in the Kyoto Agreement, what did the Howard government do? They announced the refusal to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. Change of political parties from Liberal to Labor. With Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, he ratified the Kyoto Protocol as his first act in office and attempted to set a carbon price in the form of a carbon pollution reduction scheme in 2009. But the bill failed in Parliament after members of the Liberals, Nationals and Green parties blocked it in the Senate. Fast forward to 2010 and Julia Gillard takes over as Prime Minister under her governance. A carbon price was passed into law July 2012. The funny thing, wait, no, not funny, is that carbon pricing in Australia is now routinely referred to as a carbon tax. But it needs to be more thought of as a commodity, something that can be traded and profited from. You can actually buy carbon with real money. You've got carbon offsets, carbon credits, and more. And many people benefit from this and they profit off it to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. Right now, 21.7% of global greenhouse emissions are covered by carbon pricing. I'll talk more about this soon, but when you hear a carbon tax, know that for Australia, if we export something to countries that have a carbon tax, it costs the companies here real money to trade with that other country. And this is another missed opportunity that some fools in politics don't get. Carbon pricing can yield billions of dollars for Australia, and conveniently, side point, it decreases emissions too. Winner, winner. But getting back with these people who seem to care most about, well, economics above climate, a few things got in the way of a good carrot and stick policy. First, it was watered down to cover just 500 companies of the initial 1,000 that was slated for the carbon price eligibility. And weirdly, well, maybe not so weirdly, agriculture and petrol were exempt. Fossil fuel protection? You bet. In just 2 years since the introduction of a carbon tax, what do you suppose happened to Australia's emissions? They dropped. We're on our way, folks, 9 years after the Kyoto Protocol came into effect. But along comes a wrecking ball in the form of Tony Abbott, a Liberal Prime Minister who took to the election a campaign with a catchy little slogan, "Axe the tax" or "Scrap the tax," which some people bought, ironically. Recalling your doers and fossil fuel lovers, Abbott is from Team Climate Deny, and he sold a lie to Australian voters by saying that by scrapping the carbon tax, he would save Australians 5 to 10% in living costs. Did the conversation around lost billions of dollars in carbon credits ever get mentioned? No, of course not. Don't be silly. No, they ran with the usual, we're good economic managers. They're not. And that such policies are bad for Australia because they're uncosted. But what happened when these buffoons scrapped the tax? Electricity bills went up, carbon emissions went up, and we lost out on billions of dollars in the carbon market. Yeah, good economic managers indeed. Let's all just savor this photo and burn it into our memories, shall we? Okay, moving on. Tony replaces a carbon pricing system with its direct action policy, a form of emissions reduction fund and mechanism to set industrial emission baselines. Emissions since 2014-2015? Well, surprise, surprise, they went up. But there might be a saviour around the corner. Time for a new hero, one in the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who, unlike his Neanderthal Liberal Party members, he actually supports climate action. He signed Australia to the Paris Climate Agreement in December 2015 to reduce Australia's emissions by 26 to 28% of 2005 levels by 2030. But he doesn't set any commitment for net zero emissions by 2050. Over the next 2 years, several significant events occur, one of which is a Finkel Review, a major report which recommends a clean energy target and proposes that Australia should commit to zero emissions not by 2050 but by 2070. Yeah, 2070 is a bit late, folks. But what does the Liberal National Party room do? They reject Finkel's proposal and instead announce a national energy guarantee which promises to keep the lights on whilst reducing emissions between 2020 and 2030. Haha! From what? Coal and gas? Which is neither reliable nor emission reducing? Funny stuff. So what happened under the NEG or the NEG? Carbon emissions went up, electricity prices too, and reliability still terrible. I'll talk more about energy and tech soon, but in the meantime, you have these guys pushing their agenda, profiting more than ever and paying no tax. And to add insult to injury, these companies not only got more than $10 billion in direct government payments, but also nearly $2 billion in fuel credits. to run machines that pull coal out of the ground, which pollutes our world even more. Good one, Australian government. Tech, not taxes, right? Now, for those familiar, you may have noticed an obvious omission. Something that happened in 2015, but it actually belongs rightly here.
When was it? The time was Olympic when you're about to be, have water lapping at your hands.
That was Immigration Minister Peter Dutton with then Prime Minister Tony Abbott being overheard quipping about the plight of Pacific Island nations and them facing rising sea levels due to climate change. This contempt is not only the first time that Australia has actually used its money and influence to do as little as possible to combat climate change. No. In this revealing article by Greenpeace, they found at the Pacific Island Forum meetings in 2015, 2018 and 2019, the Australian government attempted to use its power and aid money to dilute the forum's official communique and block regional consensus on emission reductions. The Australian government blocked a Pacific region consensus on supporting a 1.5 degree warming limit at the Pacific Island Forum in the immediate months before COP26, that is, the Paris Climate Agreement, same year. In 2018, the Australian government objected to the wording, "Climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific." In 2019, the Australian government tried to coerce Pacific Island leaders into watering down the Declaration on Urgent Climate Action Now, which, according to Pacific Island leaders, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison was explicit in offering aid in exchange for diluted language in the declaration. And it's with great joy that in May 2019, Tony Abbott lost his seat to pro-climate action independent Zali Steggall, who proposed a UK-style carbon budget legislation for Australia. Last year, Mr. Angus Taylor, Minister for Emission Reductions and Energy, released the Technology Investment Roadmap and examined more than 140 technologies for potential investment between now and 2050. They include electric vehicles, biofuels, batteries, hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. But importantly, it supports the continued use of fossil fuels, which by all accounts is not a way to decarbonise our world. How can a guy whose job it is to reduce emissions support fossil fuels? Easy. You dress it up as carbon capture and storage because it's a cure-all for everything, isn't it? As you can see, we've done a great job. Political manipulation and distortion of the energy market so that we can keep doing this. But what we don't want you to know is that most of the supposed solutions to reduce emissions are just a bunch of lies and misrepresentations. Do you really think we care about emissions? But my script is in the right place. All right, go back.